Haley Falconer. Haley Falconer is the Environmental Division Manager for the City of Boise. In this role, Haley oversees the water quality, water renewal planning, and materials management programs for the city. Her role includes tracking and implementing environmental, economic, and community projects and programs throughout the city. Prior to this role, Haley served as the Sustainability Coordinator for the city. Before joining the city, Haley worked as a wastewater project manager for HDR Engineering in Boise. She received her undergraduate degree in civil engineering from North Dakota State and her master's in environmental engineering from Washington State. So please welcome Steve and Haley, and it's all yours, Steve.
Great, thank you, Louisa. Let me see if I can get our slides up here and we'll get started.
Okay, Marie, I think you need to stop sharing.
There we go. I think I was able to take control there.
All righty.
Just confirming that everyone can see that full screen.
No, Steve, it's giving us the kind of preview.
Okay. How about now?
There you go.
Good to go.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thanks. Haley and I are really excited to be here with all of you today and give you an overview on the city's climate action roadmap and then kind of a deeper dive into some of the water elements. So we'll split the presentation with myself taking kind of the front end and the broader climate action information, and then Haley will zoom in on several of our water related items. With that, there we go. I wanted to just start with a little background today on kind of why the city developed a climate action roadmap. Certainly we've been pretty engaged over recent years in a number of sustainability and environmental issues. And I really like the mention of Haley's initial role as the sustainability coordinator in her resume, because her work is really the genesis for a lot of work that myself and my team get to do now on some of our climate work. And we're really kind of, tee up this conversation in the context of local climate action by what we're seeing here regionally and the impacts that we're already starting to see from climate change. So a couple graphics that are a little old here, but I think still relevant. Starting on the left there, that was the fire heat map from 2020. Unfortunately, I think the 2021 map looks similar or worse. And then as you rotate around the slide clockwise, you can see the smoke impact from Washington and Oregon fires. That was a photo that Boise State published from the foothills looking towards downtown, and you can see the impacts that we're seeing there. And then moving down to the bottom right, noting the regional impacts that we saw with drought severity this past year, as seeing a lot of that red or extreme drought across the state of Idaho as we moved into the fall. I know there's some encouraging content with some of the snow numbers so far, but the water resources and fire impacts continue to be concern that we think about in our work. And what we're seeing there really lines up well with the work that we did back in 2016 to develop what we refer to as the Boise Climate Adaptation Assessment. So this was one of our initial planning documents that dealt with climate impacts regionally. And we worked with the University of Idaho and other groups to take a look at a combination of a number of different climate models and then start to figure out what those impacts would be out through the remainder of the current century. And you can see a summary of those in the bullets in the middle of the slide there. But interestingly enough, 6 of the top 8, so heavy precipitation, irrigation demands, drought frequency, stream flows, flooding danger, and water quality. 6 of those top 8 tie to water. So I think really displays the significance of our climate work and how it interacts with our water work, and will tie to some of the areas that Haley will touch on in her slides. And then most importantly, not forgetting, we spend a lot of time in the technical world and think about climate change and its technical aspects and those things. But as we message and work to deliver these programs out in the community, not forgetting to really zoom out and zoom up to some of the key issues that are most important to kind of the broad range of our residents and businesses around people, potential impacts and hopeful benefits that we can drive to public health from the work that we're doing in climate change, and also not forgetting the opportunities that come with the economic solutions that are necessary for climate mitigation and adaptation, and what they can bring in terms of economy, jobs with the solutions that are necessary there. And so I'll jump now into just talking in detail about our climate action roadmap. We're using the term roadmap, but essentially this is a climate action plan for the city. And we wanted to focus really on implementation when we thought about building out this roadmap. Cities have a tendency of developing pretty detailed planning documents, and then sometimes they end up sitting on a shelf and not getting implemented. So it was really important to us to focus on those aspects of implementation and really work to how we could prioritize both things that we need to do near term or are already working on currently, and then also balance what we need long term, recognizing that there are various elements of climate action that will play out over time. Another item that we really observed rapidly is that across the spectrum of different city programs, there are a lot of activities currently happening that relate to climate action. And we really wanted to build out, capitalize on those, and then bring them in together under one document to help organize them and build a general focus around climate action. As some of the folks on the call know, we've done kind of discrete work around clean energy transition, around water, parks and open space, so on and so forth. But we really didn't have a document that really brought all those different initiatives together under one focus or one umbrella. And so that was definitely another purpose of the roadmap. A key purpose, and one that we talk about frequently, was the identification of climate action goals. And we've done that here within the roadmap, and I'll touch on those in just a second. We want to certainly highlight opportunities to leverage public involvement with various implementation activities. So that'll come out in some of the subsequent slides. And then ultimately, to that theme of not having a document that sits on a shelf, we really wanted to focus on this roadmap being a living and evolving document that can adjust with new policy, technology, and community needs, because we know there's almost something new happening every day with climate, whether it be new science or new technology or implementation or things that can support our work. And we wanted to make sure that this document was established in a way that we could update it frequently and make adjustments as we needed to. So I'm going to animate in some graphics that kind of talk through what the orientation and outline of our roadmap is. And so we start with vision and goals, and we utilize the city's vision to create a city for everyone as sort of the foundation of the roadmap. And then from there, I mentioned the identification of climate action goals. We took a two-phased approach to goal setting. First, we set mitigation goals, which you see in the middle, and we established one for our municipal government. So essentially the city's buildings, facilities, and operations to be carbon neutral by 2035. And then we identified another for the community to be carbon neutral by 2050. And then in addition, we also developed an adaptation and a resilience goal, which you see on the right-hand side of the slide there. It's certainly more qualitative in nature, but when we analyzed a lot of the climate action plans that we saw in other cities across the United States and Canada, we really saw this two-phased approach in a lot of them, and felt that that was important to bring to Boise's plan. Obviously, we want to mitigate to the fullest extent possible and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but we also know that there are likely changes coming that we may not be able to prevent. And so we need to make sure we work on resilience and adaptation as well. And then from there, we brought in three guiding principles, and it's nice to think of these in some ways of co-benefits, and they tie back to that slide on people, health, and jobs that I presented at the beginning. But where we can, we're looking to advance equity, improve health and wellness, and grow the climate economy. And so as we work through the structure of the plan, we really tried to identify opportunities and actions that we could relate back to these three areas. So for example, if we want to work on an alternative transportation initiative, like improving bike or pedestrian ability, that certainly supports climate action because it gets people out of their cars, but it also could have a health benefit from getting them exercise or getting them more active. From there, we identified 7 priorities, and we mapped them on a spectrum moving from left to right of those where we're focused on mitigation or reducing emissions, like in energy and buildings and transportation. And then those where we're focused more on adaptation and resilience, like in our natural environment and our water. A couple sprinkled there in between that I'll call out: innovation and engagement. Certainly, participation broadly by residents and businesses is really important as we work through this. Obviously, the city has direct control in our facilities. We have a lot of opportunity to take action there, but ultimately, the success or failure of this roadmap will really be made by the community in a broad sense. And then we'll touch on food systems. It's kind of an emerging area in climate action. We thought it was important to include in our planning work, although historically it's been an area where the city and governments in general haven't been quite as active. And then within each of those 7 priorities, we identified a number of different opportunities. And I've got a slide that'll detail this in just a few minutes, but that's where we really get into kind of what the program work areas are and what the specific actions are that we need to do to kind of build up this ladder to achieve our goals, work through these priorities, and meet our guiding principles. From there, I want to talk just a little bit more about our goal setting. So what's shown here is a pie chart of our greenhouse gas emissions across our entire community. And you can see those are driven primarily by 2 sources, from the fossil fuels that we use in our transportation system in on-road, off-road, and air travel. And then and that's shown in the orange on the top half of the slide or the graphic there. And then in the bottom half in the yellow and blue is the fossil fuels that we use in our energy use, primarily in buildings and facilities. And that generally comes from the electricity generation that's fossil fuel related and the natural gas that we use in our buildings. And so our goal obviously is carbon neutral by 2050. So we want to try to take that pie chart and those numbers that you see down there as close to 0 as possible. Another question that we get asked is, how do we define carbon neutral? Because you hear a lot of terms thrown around: carbon neutral, net zero, zero emissions, and sometimes they can mean different things to different entities or different people. And so for us, it's really an approach. And so in the near term, we're really looking to focus on mitigation. So again, reducing these emissions down towards 0 to the fullest extent possible. And then from there, we'll look at some opportunities either to sequester or remove emissions. We're hearing a lot about emerging technologies in carbon sequestration, either through natural methods like tree planting or agriculture, or with using some type of emerging technology to capture carbon. And then last but not least, we also know that at least right now, there are some sources of our emissions that we don't have a clean energy or fossil fuel free solution for, and we may need to look at offsets there. But both the sequestration and offset discussion, I would say, are fairly far off into the future at this point. Last but not least, again, want to highlight that idea of community in action. These are the community's greenhouse gas emissions, so we'll certainly need help and participation from them to achieve what we've set out to do here. Jumping forward, I always think it's important to kind of share this relatively mathematical slide and graphic that you see here. And I won't spend a ton of time here, but I think this is important for a couple reasons. One, in backing up the work that we do in climate action planning, we do some pretty rigorous analysis to determine at what year we set the goal that we chose, and that there was kind of a path forward to get there. So understanding that it was ambitious, but also that it was achievable. And that achievability is kind of mapped out that you see in the colors in the diagram there. So cumulatively, when you add all of those together, those are kind of the combination of different actions that it takes to get down to carbon neutral. So, and then you can see back where some of that relates: electric vehicles, building efficiency, the electricity grid, so on and so forth. So that range of colors is where we're able to predict and calculate the gains that we expect to make in clean energy transition, in electric vehicles, so on and so forth. But there's also kind of a range of unknown that's shown in the dark gray that cuts across the middle of the slide. And those right now are areas where we're not able to predict a reduction in emissions. And so that's where we're going to need things like advocacy and policy, like new technology, or potentially carbon sequestration or offsets that I talked about in the last slide. And we can certainly revisit this in the questions if anyone would like to take a deeper dive, but I'll leave it there for right now. And then this slide, going back to kind of the walkthrough and the animations of the different elements of the climate action roadmap, this really builds out the opportunities across those 7 different priority areas that I talked about. So again, you can get a feel for how these align with some of our existing work in the city. For example, the consumption and waste opportunity aligns with our trash recycling and composting programs that we have. Some of the work in buildings and energy, obviously our geothermal energy resource is kind of a unique thing to Boise, where there's some capacity to make progress. And then pointing out the 3 that are water related, and Haley, as we transition over to Haley's portion of the slides, she'll do her best to kind of build these out and offer some additional details there. Let me pause quickly before we move over to Haley and see if there is any questions in the chat, or if anyone would like to ask kind of a general question on the first portion of the slides.
Okay, there's no questions in the chat.
Okay, great. Thanks, Louisa. Well, with that, I'll hand it over to Haley.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, and good to see all of you, or know that you are all here. It's nice to have a chance to visit about this topic, and really appreciate what Steve shared about us as the city not wanting to plan for planning's sake, but really to plan or build these roadmaps to help us implement work. And that has been really important in the water side of things, to have the climate action roadmap to really lay out why we're doing this and what some of these kind of the three things on the slide here are tied to that are broader than water alone and really tied into this resiliency. So the three opportunities in the water, I'm going to get my words wrong now, Steve. Priority. There we go. Our water conservation, water supply resilience, and then one for water quality, stormwater management, and flooding. And so there are a variety of activities within this. And so for the purpose of today, I tried to pull these pieces together with some ongoing work that we have going on in this space and really kind of dive into a little bit of the details, not a lot of the details. So the next slide really jumps into that water resiliency approach. When we talk about water, what it is that we want to focus on is preserving the groundwater that we have for drought conditions. We want to limit groundwater withdrawals where we can. That means, opportunities for diversification, not just of water supply for our community use, but also for things like irrigation or other needs. And really focusing on the right water for the right use. And that ties in certainly to the development of our recycled water program, but is also tied into things like shifting to surface water irrigation away from groundwater for irrigation. And of course, a highlight on conservation. We see this across any of the topics that Steve talked about related to the climate action roadmap. It is often, if not always, that efficiency is the first sort of bucket. And so whether that's energy efficiency in the energy space, water conservation, or even waste reduction, that we refuse the first thing in the first place so we don't have the ton of trash to manage on the back end. That same theory applies here in water, that we really do want to focus on water conservation across all spectrums. The next slide really aims to, when we say diversify water supply, what is it that we mean? And there's a slew of activities that we are evaluating or embarking on for understanding what our water needs are today and in the future. And Steve mentioned that 6 of the 8 kind of climate risks that the area is facing are related to water. And one of the first moves or actions the city took coming out of that was to hire a strategic water resources manager. And so that's John Roldan, for folks who may have met him. And his role is really understanding kind of this water need now and into the future. And so some of the new things that we're looking at, considering, in some ways embarking on, are where we have water rights or can look at new water rights, where there may be storage rights or flood rights. A couple of the pieces I want to dig into are right in the middle there, where we can potentially create new water supplies or use water that we already have in water renewal and produce a high quality recycled water that can be put to additional beneficial use or put into groundwater for storage for later use. And then looking at ways where there's, exchanges or possibilities of using water in different ways. So when we talk about diversification and talk about a portfolio of water, it really is a spectrum of how and where the water comes from, what we're going to need. And certainly overlaid on much of this is also policy associated with water and water use. So that kind of hits on at the very highest level, the water supply, resilience and water conservation pieces. But certainly as there are questions, we can dive into more of this. I wanted to touch on a couple of slides here just related to the recycled water program. The recycled water program was born out of our utility plan. And the intent here and what we heard from the community is that recycled water is a good approach for us to consider moving forward, because it helps us achieve those exact goals that we just talked about, where we're able to increase the resiliency and reliability of our water supply. We sort of have some autonomy there in a water supply that we can put to beneficial use, but we also have environmental benefits as well. And certainly it ties back into some of the other pieces Steve mentioned around economic development and activity, knowing that water can be a driver of those pieces. But we also want to keep this water that we have here locally to be able to put to better use. And so the city's really in the infancy of building this recycled water program right now. It is a program that was informed at the beginning by the community and will continue to be informed through community and stakeholder engagement. So the next slide highlights the sort of 5 of the key areas of how we're going to be building a program. So this isn't simply jumping from the idea of needing recycled water to building a facility that can produce that. It's really creating a program that integrates all of these pieces together. So we know that we will be sort of maybe not paving new trails on recycled water permitting, but certainly some of the first in the state around the type of permitting that we'll be talking about. There will be a tremendous amount over the next 3 years of research and innovation, pilot testing of treatment technologies, pilot testing of aquifer recharge to understand kind of where and how the water moves and what the water quality impacts are. Of course, eventual siting and land acquisition, where should these facilities go, and what are some of those considerations and other community co-benefits that we can consider. And then we're effectively creating a new utility. So there's a fair amount of policy and utility creation and partnership development, both with water suppliers, so the used water that we're collecting, and then where that recycled water goes. And all of this is really, that community engagement piece is sort of an overlay in all of this. It's really founded in community engagement that we are both seeking feedback from and sharing information with you all, with the community as a whole, on what it means and what this recycled water program is. So the next slide is a bit wonky, but it at least dives into kind of one piece of how we're doing this. So when we talk about recycled water, it was the utility plan really focused on industrial reuse and aquifer recharge. So the idea is that we're collecting used water from industry, taking that out of our existing system and moving it to a new facility, and then sending that purified water to aquifer recharge or back to the industry for us as a source of supply. And so the way that we're going to approach this is kind of start with the 2 sides of what's on this slide. So we first need to understand what the end use water quality objectives are. What is the quality of water that's required by industry or to put into the aquifer, both regulatorily, but also from a stakeholder perspective. And then look at the source water quality. So what's coming in from various industries that might feed a facility. And then we have to look in the middle at what treatment technologies can accept that source water quality and produce the end water quality that we need, so that we're meeting the various water quality objectives, both environmental and public health. So that's, I mean, this graphic really frames at a very high level what we're embarking on right now, where we're gathering source water quality data and we're evaluating and procuring pilot treatment technology to run a pilot test for 12 to 18 months to really understand the performance of those pilots. So that really is like the highest level I could provide on recycled water. Where we are now, we are under contract with an engineering program manager. We've hired a program manager internal to the city to lead this work. And we are kind of in those early planning stages with a fair amount of community engagement, focus groups and surveys and other feedback coming towards us over the course of the next few months, with the anticipated start of pilot testing in the fall of this year. So that's kind of the next steps for recycled water. Certainly this is an area we could talk a lot more about, but I've left most of the time for the next topic to really focus in on the river. So the last topic really hits on the climate action roadmap around water quality and the river. In this case, we're titling this Enhance the River. So the next slide just shows a picture kind of framing what we did in the utility plan. The utility plan was our long-term 20-year strategic document focused on water renewal. So historically, utility planning or facility planning documents were really anchored in growth and regulatory requirements, and then what building blocks do we need to create to meet those 2 things. We took a much different approach at this and focused on hearing from the community about what was important, what was the possibility around the water that we have and we manage in water renewal services, and what could we do with that. And that's really how this plan came together. And one of the component pieces of the plan was Enhance the River. And that was the idea that the river continues to be a very key value for our community, and investing and protecting the river is of great importance. So the reason it's labeled Enhance the River is because it was more than the minimum, more than the regulatory requirements, more than the minimum that we're required to do to really protect this asset that we have in the Boise River. And so that kind of framework from the utility plan on the next slide really married with past action. So the city has taken a look at regulatory compliance alternatives that provide greater environmental benefit. I mean, this really ties into a fair amount of the work that we do, and sort of that overarching piece that Steve mentioned earlier, where we want outcomes that are not only environmental outcomes, but have better economic outcomes and better community outcomes. And that was, a part of what we had looked at with the phosphorus removal facility located in Parma. And it's also how we're approaching temperature. And so temperature as kind of the sort of next or a water quality consideration on the Boise River, and certainly something that we're regulated for. I'm going to show a slide with lots of words and only say a couple things about it, but you all will have it and we can jump back to it. But what the city's doing right now is we are requesting a thermal variance, which is under 316A of the Clean Water Act. And essentially we are looking at a community of species within the Boise River that are the balanced indigenous community, and is what we're doing protective of those species in the river. And so we've been working over the last several years to have this variance in our permits, but it will allow us to take innovative approaches to really protecting the river, the habitat, kind of building that into the work that we do. What we want to avoid is sort of single outcome solutions, which would be build a chiller and cooling tower at the end of our facilities to cool the water without getting the broader environmental benefit. So the next slide really ties in why the city has been engaged in kind of the purpose of the Boise River Management Tool and how the city will be using it. I know this is an area that Bren has also been involved in, but we really want to take this tool and kind of advance the information to support the temperature variance work to really help us build those solutions that have broader environmental and regulatory benefit and really support kind of these activities that our community expects. And so I think many of you are familiar with this tool. The next slide gives a little bit more background on what what and how the tool is being developed through Flood Control District 10 and the Army Corps. But what the city is trying to take and layer onto the store is doing, not trying to, we are doing, is layer on some of the component pieces around the habitat improvements. And the kind of cost share of the city's investment was also to extend this tool so it was covering the entire lower Boise River, kind of up from the midsection up to Lucky Peak. And so what we're working on right now is understanding the hydraulic modeling, which of course has been done, and then layering on some of the additional, habitat suitability, sediment mobility, and then where we want to get is to opportunities for improvement. When we anticipate funding, we do anticipate funding projects and activities in the Boise River to get to that enhance the river. This tool and what this gets us is a way to identify potential areas. And then I'll talk a little bit later about how we will prioritize actual projects. But this is kind of the process that we're going through to get to these activities. The next slide is animated. I have no idea, Steve, how this is going to work, and it's possible you have to click and then leave. So this, and folks may have seen some of this, but this is really, in addition to understanding the flow morphology, we also want to understand velocities and the impact on sediment transport. So this is just one visualization of what that looks like as far as where and how sediment is moving and what the impact is to the river itself, and how this then ties to areas where we may want to focus our investments. And so that's, it's nice to have a pretty graphic and pretty animation as well. So the next slide, this is kind of where we're taking this, the next steps. I don't know, Steve, you may have to, earlier when I was practicing, I had to exit and then reopen it. I couldn't figure out, oh, there you go. You're better at this than I am. What we really want to do is at a broad scale, start to identify the critical areas and use these various components around habitat and stream flow and understand where our investments could have the most impact, whether that's impact in mitigation for past activity or protecting areas that should be protected in the river system, and then create sort of a plan for how we can craft projects, track progress, and ultimately measure the success of these. So the next slide gives us a little bit of a zoom in on what the tool that we're working on, kind of the enhancement of the Boise River modeling tool. So this sort of shows how we can overlay fish habitat suitability on top of the river information that's available. So really we've got a red, yellow, green sort of color scale, good, medium, and less good, I guess. I don't want to say not necessarily bad, but what we've taken is for all of those RIS species that we have identified, rainbow trout and brown trout and mountain whitefish, I think there are 8 species. We have evaluated all of those species at their various life stages and in various flow conditions to understand kind of where in the river we could have the highest impact with investment. And so this is showing the south channel of the Boise River near West Boise. So the first part of this is at low flow conditions, but we also want to understand, so Steve, if you click one more time, it'll show the same area. So we're kind of zoomed out a bit, but at high flow conditions. So I'm just showing this here today to show the impact or the possibility with the tool that we're working on, and how we'll be using that data and information to start to understand where there may be projects or possibilities for investment. And if there are more questions on this, I am not the expert, but we have her here with us today. The next slide, I've got 2 more slides here before I pause and we take questions. You know, in addition to understanding and having a tool like what I've just shown to identify the areas, we also are working on sort of a decision-making tool, because there are a wide range of types of projects that we could invest in. And we really want to make sure that we're investing in those projects that will have the greatest beneficial outcomes. And so part of that is identifying what those outcomes are. Some of them certainly around habitat and around species in the river, but maybe there's other community benefits and expectations out of this work that we're doing. Of course, in that way, we'll layer in cost, and similar to how we've done other business case evaluations, what we'll end up with here is this multi-objective decision analysis tool that will allow us to compare potentially dissimilar projects to start to prioritize where we may want to do work. And so we'll start, with a couple of options here as we practice and build our muscles on doing this, so that we can start to make these investments in the Boise River. And so I think the last slide here really just talks about what our commitment is, and kind of what we know that we're doing in the near future, especially, is that we're going to continue to monitor temperature in the lower Boise River. We're also continuing to evaluate and measure biological activity. So macroinvertebrates, the various fish species. We're also looking at freshwater mussels and continued periphyton analysis. And then this work, we were talking about it before today's brown bag started, but just the amount of entities that do work and have activity within the Boise River. So this is not something that the city is doing on our own or in a silo. It's a tremendous amount of coordination with other agencies and organizations. And then specific to temperature, we'll be coordinating with DEQ on any of those that are required, that are regulatorily required, but the city will likely have additional kind of studies and analysis that we do that are outside of those regulatory requirements. And then this is also, from a commitment standpoint, it's also included in our capital budget. So we do have funding that we have committed to investment in Enhance the River. And so these tools are the first steps in us identifying where those investments will happen. So that was a lot in a short period of time by design, so we could have a fair amount of opportunity for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Haley. That was fantastic. Very useful information and great graphics, I have to say. You did a good job with those. We have, no, it's amazing how much the graphics can lend itself to a deeper understanding of, for those of us who are, visual learners, I guess I would say, a picture does tell 1,000 words. So we have a few questions for you in the chat box, and let me get to those.
I've got them up if you want
Okay.
to handle it.
You know what, Louisa, let's start with the first one and go through.
Okay. In terms of the wastewater source of new water. Will the city look at allowing homeowners to capture and use their gray water for irrigating lawns and gardens?
I think the answer to that is maybe. I mean, I guess look at is probably vague enough to say I think so. This definitely came up in the stakeholder. We had an advisory group that was comprised of 24 people from across a wide range of sectors that participated in a 6-month advisory group. So this did come up a fair amount in there when it and shook out as a priority for that group up until we layered cost into the scenario. So where this may come up and is on it's not in the recommended portfolio that came out of the utility plan, but it's in more of the to be evaluated on an ongoing basis, would be more around new development. So, the potential for new development or a particular development that was interested in this that we could partner with in some way, because that would really be, I think, on a broader scale, the way to accomplish that would be in a new development scenario. As far as existing, and I don't want to misspeak, I don't know, Steve, if you know, I don't know that we have anything that would disallow anyone from using their gray water, but at a more of a kind of broader scale, that would be the city's role down the road.
Haley, I certainly won't claim to be the expert, but we did have this question come up a couple months ago, and there is a section in the state plumbing code that addresses gray water use. Without getting into too much detail, there are some strings attached and some approvals required through IDEQ. It looks like for I think it's irrigation related or reuse in urinals, things like that. So I can, if anybody's really interested, I can get this information sent over to take a deeper look.
Thank you, Steve.
It looks like Louisa had that question. So Louisa, I'll pass that along to you.
Well, it's just, I know that there are places where people are capturing and reusing their gray water. But it does require some extensive replumbing of an existing home in order to do that. Another question, is the city looking at ways to mitigate the summer river floaters' impact on the river and associated riparian areas?
So I don't know of anything specific related to people floating the river. However, it is something we've talked about related to water quality and just the impact or anything that changes in the summer with folks in the river. But I think an area for future opportunity, I guess maybe I'll add one of the challenge, you're certainly getting a perspective about the river today, but the river, the coordination from the city is with parks and with planning and engineering from a flooding standpoint. So we've got fire from a human safety standpoint. So we've got a few competing kind of lenses, I guess, through which the river is viewed, especially in such an urban setting. So there is certainly opportunity for continued, even internal to the city, coordination, which is really good. I think it's a good opportunity for us to understand sort of where we could have maybe small changes that would have a big impact. But as far as anything specific around the people floating the river, that has not come up. I think, I know what I was going to say, focusing on how and where people interact with the river and sort of, we've got limitations with the river ordinance, but there are conversations about where and how we have people interact and interface with the river. And do we have more of a controlled setup around that versus right now where it can be really dispersed? But no, nothing in great detail.
Okay. There's a question, how would community partners like Trout Unlimited impact this program? And I'm assuming the question is like, how might the city work with community partners to help bring this to fruition?
Yeah, I'll do my best to answer that. And then Ashlyn, if I don't answer your question, please ask it or let me try again. So I think that just as the utility plan was founded in community engagement, the continuation of this work will be as well. So I've when it comes to sort of defining what enhance the river means and how these tools are built and informed and used, I think that what we'll end up with is community outreach around the values, what's important, sort of checking the values we heard in our utility plan outreach and confirming that those are still the values that the community holds that we should be prioritizing. So I think there's a piece of it there. I think the other piece of it is that we know, and I think continue to expect that work along the river will likely have better outcomes if we do those together. And I think there are good examples of those partnerships in project implementation. And we certainly hope that that is a continuation, that as we're identifying sites and identifying projects, that those can be done in partnership where that's appropriate. So I hope, Ashlyn, that answers your question.
Okay, and hopefully I had a proper interpretation of the question too.
Yes, thank you, ladies.
Perfect.
And then the next question, does that slide show pit capture? And I think it was the slide that showed the temperature. And there were it looks like a bunch of pits on either side of the river.
So at the risk of not totally getting this right, I don't think so. There are gravel pits along kind of just adjacent to both the river and the West Boise Water Renewal Facility. But even during the Snowmageddon and subsequent flooding, I don't think we anticipated and planned for potential pit capture there, but it did not happen in the way that we had planned for, I guess. And so I don't think I think what we're seeing there is just the gravel pits.
Okay. I got a couple more questions that I put in there. Will the city explore using developed wetlands as a final stage of wastewater treatment, similar to that done in Arcata, California and Forest Grove, Oregon?
Yeah, wetlands are such an interesting opportunity. So we have looked at wetland treatment both at the phosphorus removal facility on the Dixie Drain and as potential temperature compliance. And so for different reasons in both of those scenarios and really extensive analysis on both of them, wetlands were ruled out. We do continue to have conversations about what role wetlands could play potentially in our facilities. There are times of year certainly when it, especially around temperature, where there's potential, but it wouldn't. Wetlands were not a solution on their own that could get us to the temperature limits that are on our current permit. I think if we look at the two facilities that we have at Lander Street and at West Boise, the Lander Street were really size constrained, so constrained, so that may not be a possibility there, but there is possibility for it to be evaluated at West Boise, but certainly want to understand kind of what we would be using them for from a polishing standpoint as we evaluate kind of future. So I think the answer is maybe, but it has not proven out in the times where we have looked at it for very specific purposes.
Okay. And then does the city have a plan for removing invasive tree and shrub species and replacing them with native species along the river?
So Steve, I think the answer is yes, that Parks is doing this. I don't know at what scale, but that is not something that has been in Public Works purview.
Haley, I think you may be correct, but if I did have some information on that, it's been a while. So we can take that one as a follow-up. And if we have any information, we can share that back with Louisa.
Perfect.
Does anybody else have questions? Because if not, I got more.
Louisa, this is Maria. I was just going to throw out there, the city started their presentation with it was near the beginning, a slide of all the different aspects of water. And being a employee a long time ago of the Idaho Department of Water Resources, I thought to myself, those are all water right issues. And I was wondering if the city was aware of Jeff Faraday, who's a water rights attorney in the Valley, wrote a white paper a number of years ago about the very topics you were talking about in that slide. And I'm wondering, I just thought I would pass along the information that white paper is available on the internet. And I don't know if you've had a chance to see it or not.
We have, and yes, there's a tremendous amount of water rights overlap with each of these. And that is really, I mentioned the hiring of John Roldan. So that's a fair amount of his work is understanding and managing the city's water rights portfolio, not only for public works, but really broadly. And then how some of those pieces tie into some of the other sort of management activities that we're considering. But yes, we do have Jeff Faraday's paper, and we've also we've engaged additional kind of water rights attorneys and our own kind of training internally and things to understand where we need to be paying attention on a few of these issues.
Yes, when it comes to water management, it all comes down to water rights. And that's a really interesting field, and it's complex. And as I'm sure you know, dealing with the irrigation districts and irrigation companies, that is usually an education in itself. Very interesting organizations, and I've always enjoyed working with them through the years.
Yeah, I think maybe a nice tie back to Steve's work as well. I think what we found, and especially with John in this role and having someone who can really be dedicated to this with his team, that relationship building is so important. And I mean, like many things, it really comes down to people. But also we're really hopeful that, well, not hopeful, we're seeing that there's areas of shared benefit. So, we talk about, whether it's exchanges or how that water is used, or, as we see climate change impacts and water supply impacts and drought, recycled water could become a source of supply in that way as well. But also one of the things, recently have been conversations about pathways. So when we talk about different modes of transportation throughout the city, the conversation around irrigation canals and the potential for pathways, it's complicated and it's challenging, but it's also, a tie between these relationships and ongoing activity and work with also the need for changing transportation options when it comes to how we get there on some of these climate action pieces as well. So definitely it's complex, but it's been fun to see it's all sort of come together.
Yeah, it's a challenging field, and you guys have a challenge in front of you, but I'm sure that you seem to embrace it with all optimism, and looks like you're doing some good planning and asking the right questions and seeking the right answers. And I'm sure that the city will be able to do good things in both the near and long-term future. So I don't see any other questions in the chat box. I don't know if...
I have another question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Louisa, go right ahead.
And this is from my ignorance, since I'm a relative recent transplant to the Treasure Valley. And it's an issue that has come up in some other places I've lived, is how does the city manage stormwater runoff? I know in some places it goes through the wastewater treatment plant, and during high intensity storms, which are expected to increase with climate change, it can overwhelm the wastewater plant and wind up dumping pollutants into the river.
I can take that. Yeah, prior to my, that's a great question. Prior to my current role, when I came to the city, I was our stormwater program coordinator on Haley's team. So I've got some context there. to share. So to the first part of the question, the city has all separate stormwater systems here. There's no combination of those systems except in the case of kind of inflow or infiltration in flooding or sort of out of the ordinary type events. So those systems are separate. The operation of the stormwater systems is where things gets a bit complicated in our community, because typically the vast majority of a city's storm drain system is located along public roadways. And here in Boise, those are operated separately by the Ada County Highway District. And then all of the different cities kind of layer on their own programs on top of that. So generally in Boise, there's kind of that split between the storm drainage systems that are managed within the roadway by the highway district, and then those generally on private property. So think commercial and industrial and kind of multifamily or apartment development. That's where the city plays a bigger role. We've had a stormwater ordinance since the early 1990s. And it has been pretty predominantly focused on infiltration, and I would say has been relatively successful in doing so in the past with kind of, your original sort of infiltration type best management practices, nothing particularly fancy. And then over maybe the last 10 years or so has drifted a little more into some of the bioretention and green stormwater infrastructure practices. In terms of capacity and kind of how those systems function, sort of up to this point with the combination of soils with a high infiltration rate combined with relatively low rainfall amounts, at least comparatively to other parts of the country, the systems are typically designed to handle a really tremendous amount of runoff in a short period of time. And so I think there is good capacity, at least in those kind of post 1990 developed areas for additional storm flows. Obviously, like all cities, we do have kind of legacy problems from our older parts and some of our older communities or more dense areas that were developed prior to stormwater requirements. Glad to go into any more detail there if you're interested, Louisa.
No, I think it just hearing the fact that they're separate systems is a great start. Does anybody else have any questions?
All right, it appears that we've run through everyone's questions and comments. So I'd like to thank Steve and Haley for making this presentation today, putting it together for us and taking the time to present it and answer all of our questions. And we look forward to updates in the future. I don't know if you have an implementation plan put together yet with anything as specific as deadlines and such, but we really appreciate your talk today, and hopefully in the future we can get some updates from you. And also, don't forget that Bren can be a resource. We can help with projects, we can help review plans and offer comments and suggestions. We can help with social media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So don't forget that Bren is out there and we can be a resource. So thank you very much, and we look forward to another great presentation in the future. And thank you to everyone for coming today. This is our last brown bag that's scheduled for the immediate future, so keep an eye on our website and our Facebook page and other social media for information about future brown bag presentations. And if you have any ideas for us, please send them to us. You can contact us at info@boiseriverinhancement.org, and we'll try to put together future brown bags that might address your interests. So thank you, everyone. I hope to visit our website, and I hope to see folks at future presentations.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good day.
Thank you very much.